The temperature inside submarine B-59 had reached 135 degrees Fahrenheit, carbon dioxide levels at 7%. Men were passing out in shifts, and the nuclear torpedo in compartment 2 was live, armed, and awaiting authorization. Captain Valentin Savitsky wanted to fire it. Political officer Ivan Maslennikov agreed. That was 2 signatures. One more, and the 10-kiloton warhead would streak toward the American carrier group 12 miles above them. What they didn't know, what the system they'd been trained to trust had made impossible to know, was that the Americans weren't attacking. The depth charges were signals, not weapons. Practice grenades containing 4.5 pounds of TNT, not 600. A warning to surface, not a declaration of war. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. To understand how 3 men came to vote on ending civilization, we need to understand how the system was designed to fail. October the 27th, 1962. 400 feet below the surface of the Caribbean Sea. Submarine B-59 of the Soviet Northern Fleet had been running submerged for nearly 4 days. The Foxtrot-class diesel-electric submarine was never designed for this. Built for patrols in the cold waters of the Arctic and North Atlantic, its cooling systems were engineered for temperatures that rarely exceeded 50 degrees Fahrenheit. Now, operating in tropical waters south of Cuba, those systems were failing catastrophically. The air conditioning had quit on day 2. The ventilation system followed on day 3. By day 4, the submarine had become a steel coffin, slowly cooking its crew alive. In the engine room, temperatures exceeded 150 degrees. The diesel generators, running constantly to maintain battery charge and life support, radiated heat that had nowhere to go. The hull, pressurized and sealed, trapped every BTU. Men worked in 15-minute shifts before collapsing. Meanwhile, in the crew quarters, 78 sailors shared bunks in spaces designed for 50. The humidity approached 100%. Condensation dripped from every surface. The smell, unwashed bodies, diesel fuel, battery acid, and fear was overpowering. But the real killer was invisible. Carbon dioxide levels had climbed to 7%. Normal atmospheric concentration is 0.04%. At 7%, human cognitive function deteriorates rapidly. Decision-making becomes impaired, judgment fails. The medical officer, Captain 3rd Rank Ryurik Ketov, had stopped counting heat casualties after reaching 40 men. Dehydration was universal. Heat exhaustion was standard. 3 sailors had suffered heat stroke. 1 was unconscious. Yet the submarine couldn't surface. Not yet. Not while American forces were hunting them. The crew of B-59 had no idea they'd become the most dangerous object on Earth. In compartment 2, nestled among the conventional torpedoes, sat a single weapon unlike anything the Americans knew existed. The Soviets called it a special weapon, a nuclear-tipped torpedo with a 10-kiloton yield, 2/3 the power of the bomb that destroyed Hiroshima. The Americans hunting them had no idea it was there. US intelligence had assured President Kennedy that the Soviets would never put tactical nuclear weapons on submarines. That assessment was wrong. 4 Foxtrot-class submarines had departed the Soviet Union in early October. B-4, B-36, B-59, and B-130. Each carried one nuclear torpedo. Each was ordered to patrol near Cuba during the escalating crisis. Each was given authorization protocols that assumed they could maintain communication with Moscow. But communication required surfacing to extend the radio antenna. And surfacing meant detection. And detection meant harassment by American anti-submarine warfare forces. So the submarines stayed deep, ran silent, and slowly lost contact with the world above. B-59 hadn't received communication from Moscow in 4 days. The last message, received on October the 23rd, had been routine patrol orders. Then silence. The crew had no idea that on October the 22nd, President Kennedy had announced a naval blockade of Cuba. They didn't know that the world was holding its breath, balanced on the edge of nuclear war. They only knew that American destroyers were dropping depth charges on them. The attack had begun at 4 o'clock in the afternoon. The submarine's sonar operator, Senior Lieutenant Vadim Orlov, detected the first explosion at a range of 200 meters. Then another, then another. 11 explosions in rapid succession, each one closer than the last. The sound inside the submarine was indescribable. Each explosion hit the hull like a massive hammer. The lights flickered. Equipment jumped off its mounts. Men grabbed whatever they could hold. In the control room, Captain Valentin Savitsky's face had gone from red to purple. The 34-year-old submarine commander, veteran of dozens of patrol missions, was screaming at his officers. Not orders, not commands, just rage. Maybe the war has already started up there while we are doing somersaults here. His voice carried through every compartment despite the explosions. We're going to blast them now. We will die, but we will sink them all. We will not disgrace our navy. Political officer Ivan Maslennikov stood beside him, nodding agreement. The political officer's role in the Soviet Navy was to ensure ideological compliance and maintain morale. In this moment, faced with what appeared to be an attack by imperialist forces, agreeing to retaliate wasn't just strategically sound, it was politically mandatory. That was 2 of 3 authorization signatures. Standing in the corner of the control room, silent amid the chaos, was the 3rd signature. Brigade Chief of Staff Vasily Alexandrovich Arkhipov, 36 years old, gaunt, quiet, respected by the crew in the way that survivors are respected. Arkhipov wasn't supposed to be on B-59. As flotilla commander, he could have ridden any of the 4 submarines. He'd chosen this one. That choice would change history. But to understand why Arkhipov said no when every training exercise, every doctrine manual, every instinct told him to say yes, we need to understand what happened 16 months earlier. We need to talk about K-19. July 4th, 1961. The Soviet submarine K-19, a Hotel-class ballistic missile submarine, was conducting exercises in the North Atlantic. Brand new, state-of-the-art. The first Soviet submarine capable of launching nuclear missiles while submerged. Vasily Arkhipov was the deputy commander, second in command, responsible for damage control and safety systems. At 4 o'clock in the morning, a coolant pipe in the nuclear reactor fractured. Reactor temperature began climbing immediately, 1,000 degrees Celsius within minutes. The backup cooling system, rushed into service due to construction delays, didn't work. The emergency cooling system had never been properly tested. If the reactor melted through its containment, the entire submarine, carrying 3 nuclear missiles, would become a radioactive tomb at the bottom of the Atlantic. Or worse, the missiles could detonate. Captain First Rank Nikolai Zatiev, the commanding officer, faced an impossible choice. Surface near NATO naval forces and risk capture of the Soviet Union's most advanced submarine, or stay submerged and watch his crew die of radiation poisoning. He chose to surface, but first, someone had to enter the reactor compartment and jury-rig a cooling system using whatever they could find. Arkhipov organized the damage control teams. 8 men volunteered, knowing what it meant. They entered the reactor space in shifts, wearing nothing but cotton coveralls. No radiation suits existed on board. They rigged a backup cooling loop using pipes and pumps meant for entirely different systems. It worked. The reactor temperature stabilized. K-19 limped back to port. All 8 men who entered the reactor compartment died within 3 weeks. Acute radiation syndrome. Their bodies simply dissolved from the inside. 5 more crew members died within 2 years. Arkhipov absorbed enough radiation to require hospitalization. He survived. Barely. The Soviet Navy's response was not gratitude. It was a tribunal. Captain Zatiev was questioned for weeks about why he'd surfaced near NATO forces, why he'd risked capture, why he'd shown weakness. The submarine itself was nicknamed Hiroshima by its crew, a cursed ship, a death trap, a system designed to fail. Arkhipov learned something from K-19 that no training manual could teach. He learned that the systems the Soviet Navy designed, the protocols, the procedures, the fail-safes, were built by men who'd never faced the reality those systems were meant to handle. He learned that sometimes the system tells you to do one thing, and survival requires doing another. He learned that rushed decisions made in crisis, made in heat, made in fear, kill people. Now, 16 months later, in a submarine even hotter than K-19's reactor compartment, with his commanding officer screaming about attacking the Americans, Arkhipov was about to apply that lesson. But first, we need to understand the authorization protocol that put him in this position. The Soviet Navy's nuclear authorization procedure for submarines was simple. Devastatingly simple. 3 officers had to agree: the commanding officer, the political officer, and the second in command, or, in this case, the flotilla commander riding as a passenger. All 3 had to sign the authorization document. All 3 had to insert their launch keys. All 3 had to turn those keys simultaneously. The system was designed as a safeguard against a rogue commander starting a war. 3 signatures meant 3 chances to stop a mistake. 3 independent judgments. 3 opportunities for sanity to prevail. Except the system had a fatal flaw. It assumed those 3 officers would be making decisions under normal circumstances, in contact with Moscow, with accurate intelligence, with clear heads. Instead, the Soviet Navy had created a scenario where 3 men, trapped in a steel tube 400 feet underwater, breathing poisoned air, cooking in 135-degree heat with impaired cognitive function from CO2 poisoning, would be asked to make the most important decision in human history. And the system assumed they'd get it right. Meanwhile, the design of the submarine itself made rational decision-making nearly impossible. The Foxtrot-class submarine's communication system required extending a radio antenna to receive VHF transmissions from Moscow. That antenna had to break the surface, which meant the submarine had to surface, or at least come to periscope depth. But coming to periscope depth in hostile waters meant detection. And B-59's orders were explicit. Maintain stealth, avoid detection, patrol assigned sector. So Captain Savitsky had kept the antenna retracted, which meant no communication, which meant no new orders, which meant the last orders he'd received from 4 days ago before the crisis escalated were all he had to work with. Those orders said, if attacked, defend yourself. The orders didn't say, if you hear explosions that sound like depth charges but are actually signaling devices, remain calm and surface for identification. The orders didn't say, American forces will use practice depth charges containing 4.5 pounds of TNT as a non-lethal warning. The orders didn't say, don't assume the war has started just because you're being harassed. The orders especially didn't say, if you lose contact with Moscow for 4 days while running, submerged in 135-degree heat with 7% CO2 in the air, maybe your judgment is impaired. Instead, the orders said, defend the submarine, defend the motherland, complete your mission. And Savitsky was following his orders. The nuclear torpedo in compartment 2 had a range of 19 kilometers, 12 miles. The American carrier group above them, including the aircraft carrier USS Randolph, multiple destroyers, and support vessels, were well within range. The warhead would detonate approximately 2 kilometers below the surface, 1.2 miles. Deep enough to avoid immediate detection of the source, but shallow enough to generate a devastating pressure wave. Every ship within a mile would be destroyed outright. Every ship within 3 miles would suffer catastrophic damage. Casualties would number in the thousands. And then, inevitably, the Americans would retaliate. This is what Arkhipov understood, and Savitsky, in his heat-addled rage, could not grasp. Launching the torpedo wouldn't save B-59. It would doom the world. The argument in B-59's control room lasted approximately 30 minutes. We know this from the testimony of Senior Lieutenant Vadim Orlov, the communications officer, who survived and later recounted the events in interviews and his memoir. Savitsky stood by the chart table, authorization document in hand, demanding signatures. Maslennikov, the political officer, had already signed. His pen sat on the table. Arkhipov stood near the periscope station, arms crossed. "Comrade Captain," Arkhipov said quietly, "we don't know if war has been declared." Savitsky gestured violently toward the hull. Another explosion rattled the submarine. "You hear that? They're trying to sink us. They're trying to force us to surface, so they can capture us, so they can parade us in front of their cameras, so they can identify us," Arkhipov corrected. "It's standard procedure. We've used the same tactic ourselves." This was true. Soviet anti-submarine forces used similar harassment techniques against NATO submarines detected in Soviet waters. Warning depth charges, harassment, forced surfacing for identification. But Savitsky wasn't hearing it. The captain had been awake for over 24 hours. The heat was unbearable. His uniform was soaked through with sweat. His face was purple from burst capillaries caused by heat stress. "We have our orders," Savitsky insisted. "Defend the submarine." "Our orders also require maintaining contact with Moscow," Arkhipov replied. We haven't received communication in 4 days. We don't know the tactical situation. We don't know if war has been declared. We are guessing." "I'm not guessing!" Savitsky slammed his fist on the chart table. "I can hear them attacking us." Another explosion. Closer this time. The submarine shuddered. Somewhere in the engineering spaces, something metallic fell and clattered across the deck. Maslennikov, the political officer, spoke up. "Comrade Brigade Chief, with respect, the Americans have placed a blockade around Cuba. They've declared their intention to stop Soviet ships. This is an act of war." "It's a quarantine," Arkhipov said. Kennedy called it a quarantine, not a blockade. There's a difference. A difference in words. A difference in intent. Archipov's voice remained level, calm. If the Americans wanted war, they would have struck already. They wouldn't be dropping warning charges. They'd be dropping real depth charges. 600 pounds of TNT, not 4 pounds. Savitsky stared at him. "How do you know they're warning charges?" "Because we're still alive." The control room fell silent except for the hum of electric motors and the breathing of exhausted men. The crew had gathered at their stations, watching, waiting. The nuclear torpedo sat 12 meters away in compartment 2, armed, ready, awaiting only the authorization code that would activate its guidance system. Orlov, the communications officer, later recalled feeling like he was watching 2 different realities compete for dominance. Savitsky's reality, where the war had started and they were under attack. Archipov's reality, where this was a misunderstanding that could still be resolved. Both men were working with the same information, the same explosions, the same heat, the same isolation. But they'd reached opposite conclusions. The difference was K-19. Arkhipov had seen what happens when submarine officers make crisis decisions without complete information. He'd watched 8 men die because the safety systems everyone trusted had failed. He'd survived a tribunal because he'd done something the system didn't account for. He'd improvised. Now, facing another crisis, another failing system, another moment where the procedures were inadequate for the reality, Arkhipov was improvising again. "We can surface," he said. "We can extend the antenna. We can request orders from Moscow. If war has been declared, they'll confirm it. If it hasn't, they'll tell us what to do." "And if the Americans fire on us while we surface?" Maslennikov demanded. "Then we'll know the war has started and we can make an informed decision. But right now, we're guessing. And I won't end the world based on a guess." Savitsky's hand moved to his sidearm. Some accounts claim he drew it. Others say he simply touched it. Orlov's memoir is ambiguous on this point. What's certain is that the control room crew tensed, expecting violence. But Arkhipov didn't flinch. He'd faced reactor meltdowns. He'd absorbed enough radiation to kill a normal man. He wasn't going to be intimidated by an exhausted submarine captain with impaired judgment. "Comrade Captain," Arkhipov said softly, "I was on K-19. I watched men die because we rushed decisions. I won't make that mistake again." The mention of K-19 changed something. Everyone in the Soviet submarine service knew about K-19, the cursed ship, the floating Chernobyl, The submarine that nearly started a war by surfacing near NATO forces with a melting reactor. If anyone had earned the right to question orders, it was the man who'd survived that. Savitsky lowered his hand from his sidearm. "We surface," he finally said. "But if they fire on us, we launch." Agreed? Arkhipov nodded. Agreed. The authorization document remained unsigned. 400 feet above submarine B-59, aboard the destroyer USS Coney, Commander Donald Somerville checked his watch. 4:45 p.m. 45 minutes since they'd begun dropping practice depth charges. The Soviet submarine still hadn't surfaced. This was unusual. Standard procedure called for unidentified submarines to surface after the first or second warning charge. This submarine had absorbed 11. Either it was extremely stubborn or something was wrong. Somerville didn't know he'd been trying to signal a submarine that couldn't receive his signals. He didn't know the Soviet crew thought they were under attack. He didn't know there was a nuclear weapon above, 12 miles below his ship. What Somerville did know was that his orders were clear: locate Soviet submarines, force them to surface for identification, track their movements, but do not engage with lethal force unless attacked. The practice depth charges, officially designated PDC Mark 64, were signaling devices, nothing more. 4.5 pounds of TNT wrapped in a steel casing, loud enough to be heard clearly through a submarine's hull, harmless unless you were standing directly next to one when it detonated. By contrast, a real anti-submarine depth charge contained 600 to 1,200 pounds of high explosive. If the USS Coney had been trying to sink B-59, the submarine would already be wreckage on the ocean floor. But this distinction was lost on the Soviet crew. Meanwhile, in Washington, President John F. Kennedy was dealing with multiple simultaneous crises, none of which involved B-59 specifically because he didn't know B-59 existed. The president knew that Soviet submarines were operating near Cuba. U.S. Navy anti-submarine forces had detected and tracked 4 contacts. But intelligence estimates assured Kennedy that these were conventional diesel-electric boats carrying conventional torpedoes. Annoying, but not threatening. What Kennedy didn't know, what the CIA had explicitly told him was impossible, was that any of those submarines carried nuclear weapons. The intelligence failure was comprehensive. CIA analysts had determined that the Soviet Union would never risk putting tactical nuclear weapons on submarines because submarines could be captured. The intelligence value of a captured nuclear weapon would be catastrophic. Therefore, the logic went, no nuclear weapons on submarines. The logic was sound. The conclusion was wrong. Nikita Khrushchev, the Soviet premier, had personally approved sending nuclear-armed submarines to Cuba precisely because he believed the Americans would never suspect it. 4 submarines, 4 nuclear torpedoes, a deterrent force operating in secret. If Kennedy had known, the entire Caribbean crisis would have unfolded differently. The U.S. Navy's aggressive anti-submarine tactics, designed to harass and identify conventional submarines, would never have been authorized against nuclear-armed vessels. But Kennedy didn't know. So the harassment continued. Aboard B-59, Captain Savitsky gave the order to surface. The submarine's ballast tanks began blowing. Compressed air forced water out, reducing the boat's weight, allowing it to rise. 400 feet, 300, 200. The crew held their breath, waiting for the sound of torpedoes in the water, waiting for the hull to rupture, waiting for the end. Instead, they heard nothing. At 5:15 p.m., submarine B-59 broke the surface approximately 15 miles south of Cuba. The conning tower emerged first, water cascading off the hull. The crew immediately began opening hatches, desperate for fresh air. The cool Caribbean evening air that rushed into the submarine felt like salvation. Men gasped, some cried. The temperature inside the hull began dropping immediately. On the bridge, Captain Savitsky extended the radio antenna and attempted to contact Moscow. No response. He tried again. Still nothing. The radio was functioning. The equipment had been tested, but atmospheric conditions or distance made communication impossible. Meanwhile, American ships converged on their position. The USS Coney approached from the port side. A Neptune patrol aircraft circled overhead, cameras recording everything. The Americans wanted identification. The Soviets wanted air. For 90 minutes, B-59 remained on the surface. Engines running, batteries charging, crew recovering. No one fired. No one attacked. The American ships maintained a respectful distance, observing, but not threatening. This was the moment when reality contradicted Savitsky's assumptions. If the Americans had wanted to sink them, this was their opportunity. A submarine on the surface is helpless, but no torpedoes came. No deck guns fired, just observation. Savitsky finally accepted what Arkhipov had been telling him. This wasn't an attack. It was harassment. Aggressive, yes. Dangerous, absolutely. But not war. At 6:45 p.m., B-59 submerged again and slipped away into the darkness. The nuclear torpedo in compartment 2 remained fired. The Americans photographed the submarine, recorded its characteristics, noted its departure, and filed reports that wouldn't be declassified for 40 years. None of them knew how close they'd come. Submarine B-59 limped back to the Soviet Union, arriving in mid-November 1962. The Cuban Missile Crisis had ended on October the 28th, the day after B-59 surfaced. Khrushchev had agreed to remove Soviet missiles from Cuba in exchange for American promises not to invade the island and secret agreements to remove American missiles from Turkey. The world breathed again, but for the crew of B-59, there was no celebration. Captain Savitsky was immediately hospitalized for psychological evaluation. The official diagnosis was exhaustion, but crew members later reported he'd suffered some kind of breakdown during the return voyage. He never commanded another submarine. Political officer Maslennikov faced questioning about his role in the incident, but was ultimately cleared. He continued his career in the Soviet Navy, though he never spoke publicly about October 27th. Vasily Arkhipov received no decoration, no official recognition, no acknowledgement that he'd prevented nuclear war. In the Soviet system, the incident never officially happened. Submarine B-59 had conducted a routine patrol. There had been some difficulties with American forces. The crew had performed adequately under challenging conditions. End of report. Arkhipov continued his naval career, eventually achieving the rank of Rear Admiral. He commanded submarines. He trained officers. He served quietly and competently until his retirement. He never spoke publicly about October 27th, 1962. His wife, Olga, and his daughter, Yelena, knew he'd served on submarines during the Cuban crisis. But they didn't know the details. They didn't know about the vote, the argument, the unsigned authorization document. Vasily Arkhipov died on August 19th, 1998. He was 72 years old. Cause of death: complications from kidney disease, likely related to radiation exposure from K-19 37 years earlier. His obituary in Russian naval publications mentioned his service record. It mentioned K-19. It mentioned his promotions and decorations. It did not mention that he'd saved the world. Because the world still didn't know. The first hints emerged in the late 1990s as Soviet archives opened following the collapse of the USSR. Russian historians began publishing accounts of the Cuban Missile Crisis that included details previously classified: submarine operations, nuclear weapons deployments, close calls. In 2002, Thomas Valentin, director of the National Security Archive at George Washington University, organized a conference in Havana, Cuba, commemorating the 40th anniversary of the crisis. Soviet veterans were invited. American veterans were invited. For the first time, men who'd been on opposite sides of the crisis sat in the same room and compared notes. That's when the Americans learned about the nuclear torpedoes. Robert McNamara, who'd been Secretary of Defense during the crisis, sat in the audience listening to Soviet submarine veterans describe their weapons. When they mentioned nuclear-tipped torpedoes on the Foxtrot submarines, McNamara went pale. "The what?" he interrupted. The Soviet veterans repeated it. 4 submarines, 4 nuclear torpedoes, 10 kilotons each, operating near Cuba throughout the crisis. McNamara turned to the American veterans. Did we know this? No one had known. Arthur Schlesinger Jr., the historian who'd been a Kennedy advisor during the crisis, was also present. His response captured the room's collective horror. No one should believe that US troops could have been attacked by tactical nuclear warheads without responding with nuclear warheads. And where would it have ended? In utter disaster. Then, the Soviet veterans told the story of B-59. The depth charges, the heat, the CO2, the authorization protocol, the vote. And they told the story of Vasily Arkhipov saying no. The room fell silent. Admiral Vadim Orlov, the communications officer who'd witnessed the argument, was weeping. "That was the day we didn't start World War III, he said. The conference attendees did the math. If Arkhipov had said yes, B-59 would have fired its nuclear torpedo at the American carrier group. The USS Randolph and its escorts would have been destroyed. Thousands dead. President Kennedy, believing the Soviet Union had deliberately attacked American forces with nuclear weapons, would have had no choice but to respond. The US had nuclear weapons stationed throughout the Caribbean, ready to strike Cuba. Strategic bombers were already airborne, carrying thermonuclear weapons toward fail-safe points. Once the first nuclear weapons flew, the escalation would have been unstoppable. Soviet forces in Cuba would have responded. American forces would have struck Soviet territory. Moscow would have launched ICBMs. Washington would have retaliated. In 1962, the United States had approximately 27,000 nuclear warheads. The Soviet Union had approximately 3,600. Not all of them would have been launched, but even a fraction would have been enough. A 2014 study, published in the journal Earth's Future, modeled a limited nuclear exchange between the US and USSR in the early 1960s. The study assumed only 350 weapons detonated, roughly 1% of the combined arsenals. The results? Immediate deaths from blast effects, 200 million people. Deaths from radiation in the following weeks, 300 million. Deaths from nuclear winter and global famine in the following years, 1 billion to 2 billion. Total casualties, over 3 billion people. Roughly half the world's 1962 population of 3.1 billion. This is what Arkhipov prevented by saying no. Here's the terrifying part. The Soviet Union didn't fix the system. After the Cuban Missile Crisis ended, after the submarines returned, after the reports were filed and the investigations completed, the authorization protocol for tactical nuclear weapons remained unchanged. 3 signatures, 3 officers. No requirement for Moscow confirmation. If anything, later Soviet doctrine gave submarine commanders more autonomy, not less. The logic was that in a real war, communication with Moscow might be impossible. Submarine commanders needed the authority to act independently. The design flaw remained. On September 26, 1983, 21 years after Archipov's decision, the system nearly failed again. Lieutenant Colonel Stanislav Petrov was the duty officer at Serpukhov 15, a Soviet early warning bunker south of Moscow. His job was to monitor satellite feeds for signs of American ICBM launches. At 12:14 a.m., the system reported a launch. 1 American Minuteman missile, trajectory toward Soviet territory. Protocol required Petrov to immediately notify his superiors, who would wake Premier Yuri Andropov, who would order retaliatory strikes. The response time was 4 minutes. Petrov hesitated. The system reported more launches, 2 missiles, then 3, then 5. 5 American ICBMs inbound to Soviet territory. Petrov had to decide. Report it and trigger World War III, or assume it was a false alarm. He chose false alarm. His reasoning was simple. If the Americans were really attacking, they'd launch hundreds of missiles, not Nuke. 5 missiles suggested a malfunction, not an attack. He was right. The satellite system had mistaken sunlight reflecting off clouds for missile exhaust, a sensor error, a false alarm. But if Petrov had followed protocol, if he'd reported the launch immediately, Soviet strategic forces would have retaliated. The Americans would have responded to the Soviet launch, and the world would have ended because of a software glitch. Petrov, like Arkhipov, was punished for saving the world. He was reprimanded for not following procedures. His career was effectively ended. He received no official recognition until 2006, 23 years later, when private organizations began giving him awards. The Soviet system, and later the Russian system, never fixed the fundamental flaw. It continued to place individual officers in positions where they had to choose between following protocol and preventing catastrophe. The United States, for its part, eventually learned about the nuclear torpedoes on the Foxtrot submarines. But it took until 2002, 40 years after the crisis, for the information to become public. The institutional response was essentially a shrug. It had worked out. No one had died. No reason to dwell on it. Except dwelling on it is exactly what we should do. Because the design flaws that nearly killed 3 billion people in 1962 are still present in nuclear command systems today. Submarines still carry nuclear weapons. Officers still have authorization to use them under certain circumstances. Communication systems still fail. Atmospheric conditions still interfere with radio signals. Heat still impairs judgment. CO2 still accumulates in sealed environments. The technology has improved. The missiles are faster. The warheads are bigger. The communication systems are more reliable. But the fundamental problem remains. Humans in crisis, making decisions with incomplete information, operating within systems designed by people who've never experienced the reality those systems are meant to handle. In 2017, the Russian Federation finally, quietly, officially recognized Vasily Arkhipov role in preventing nuclear war during the Cuban Missile Crisis. A small ceremony, a posthumous medal. His daughter, Yelena, accepted on his behalf. She was asked what her father would have thought of the recognition. He would have said he was just doing his job, she replied. And perhaps that's the most terrifying part of this entire story. Arkhipov was doing his job. The system required 3 signatures. He was one of 3. He exercised his judgment. He said no. He was doing exactly what the system intended. The system worked because one man, in one moment, made one decision based on experience the system didn't account for. K-19 had taught him something the authorization protocol couldn't teach. That rushed decisions made in crisis, made in heat, made in fear, kill people. If Arkhipov hadn't survived K-19, he wouldn't have been on B-59. If he'd been on a different submarine, B-4, B-36, or B-130, the 3rd signature would have come from someone else. Someone who hadn't watched 8 men die from radiation poisoning. Someone who hadn't faced a tribunal for improvising. Someone who might have said yes. 3 billion lives were saved by a series of coincidences so improbable that calling it luck seems inadequate. Arkhipov survived K-19's radiation. He was assigned to flotilla command. He chose B-59. He was present in the control room during the crisis. He remembered K-19's lessons. He said no. Remove any one of those coincidences, and the world ends. This is not a comforting story. This is not a story about systems working as intended. This is a story about systems failing. Comprehensively, catastrophically, repeatedly. And humanity surviving anyway, because one exhausted submarine officer in a 135-degree steel tube 400 feet underwater refused to guess. October the 27th, 1962. 3 Soviet officers voted on launching a nuclear torpedo. 2 said yes. 1 said no. The world kept spinning. And for 40 years, no one knew how close it had come to stopping.